The Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines of the Imperium of Man. In-universe, they are humanity's greatest defenders, its most peerless warriors, superhuman demigods created for the purpose of destroying anything that stands in their way. In the real world, they are the face of the 40K franchise, its icons. You see an image of a hulking figure in distinctive power armor, or simply the helmet, and you know this is about 40K. No other faction within this vast and detailed universe has been given more attention, whether that be in the form of game codexes, novels from Black Library, or even fan animation projects. On the one hand, the Space Marine exemplifies the two disparate halves that make up Warhammer 40,000. On the one hand, these are beings that are taken away as small children, genetically modified in labs that would make Dr. Frankenstein blush with envy, and are psychologically conditioned into being remorseless killing machines. They are stripped of their own humanity for the sake of defending humanity. On the other hand, there is 40K, the universe that is cartoonishly over the top. A universe where these super soldiers are capable of duking it out with BDSM-loving space elves, undead robot skeletons, literal demons egged on by ever-thirsting gods, and semi-sentient fungi that grow into muscle-bound freaks that drive machines literally made out of scrap metal, spit, and prayers. The idea that a human, or even a super-powered transhuman, can go toe-to-toe with these guys, let alone squeeze out the occasional victory, is almost too absurd to believe. It is a power fantasy that stretches credibility to the barest thread. And this over-the-top insanity all begins on Terra, with the Emperor and the Unification Wars. By Millennia 30, after surviving the interstellar Dark Age known as either the Age of Strife or simply Old Night, Terra, the homeworld of the human race, had devolved into a post-nuclear wasteland, divided into various petty kingdoms ruled by warlords who were, to varying degrees, either power-crazed, depraved, or both. Meanwhile, the Emperor, determined to destroy chaos and unite humanity under his rule, was setting his own plans in motion. And among those plans was the creation of an army. While genetically enhanced warriors were not uncommon among the various polities of the throne world, the Emperor, being an immortal perpetual already tens of thousands of years old at this point, had the advantage of possessing knowledge that most of humanity had by this point forgotten. It also didn't hurt that, by means unknown to sources, he was able to obtain at least a portion of the very powers of the Chaos Gods themselves. Whether he somehow managed to steal this power from them, or perhaps agreed to a deal which he then decided to renege on. Either way, the Emperor of Mankind is the only known entity to ever pull a fast one on the gods themselves. Perhaps for this reason, he is also the only being that the ruinous powers have ever truly feared. Whatever the exact ratios of genetic engineering to space magic, the Emperor successfully kicked off the Unification Wars by unleashing his first attempt at armies of genetic superhumans, the so-called Thunder Warriors. Although much stronger and more resilient than the Astartes that would one day replace them, the Thunder Warriors paid for their enhanced abilities with overly heightened aggression and instability, emotionally, mentally, and even genetically. This last was a deliberate part of the Emperor's plan. He had always intended the Thunder Warriors to be mere prototypes, the test group, if you will. He would watch them in action, observe their performance, as well as any problems or weaknesses, which would then be ironed out when he got around to making his real army of super soldiers. The Thunder Warriors only lasted long enough to conclude the wars for unification, and then they simply disappeared. Whether those that had survived the final battles simply died out due to their genetic instability, or were eliminated by the direct word of the Emperor, is a matter of debate among those few privileged enough to even be aware of this bit of history. The Thunder Warriors had won for the Emperor humanity's birth world, but now he had a new army, one that would win for him the galaxy. The Legiones Astartes. 20 separate armies of superhumans, each derived from the genetic material of a literal demigod known as the Primarchs. Each in turn derived in part from the genetic material of the Master of Mankind himself. While the Primarchs were scattered in their infancy thanks to the machinations of chaos, the Emperor still had enough genetic material by this point to build his initial armies of Space Marines. More than enough, at least, to begin the Great Crusade. Ultimately, what makes a Space Marine comes down to a substance called gene seed. Gene seed is kind of like stem cells in that it can differentiate to create different tissues and organs. And it is the implantation of the organs derived from gene seed, itself in turn derived from the genetic material of one of the Emperor's Primarchs, that makes a Space Marine and grants them their superhuman abilities. In a sense, the gene seed remakes the subject into a facsimile of the Primarch from which it is derived. This is also why Space Marines belonging to the same chapter or the same genetic lineage bear a certain familial resemblance, as they have been literally remolded on a genetic level to resemble their Primarch. This is why Space Marines often refer to one another as brother, and back in the Legion days, their Primarch was referred to as father or sire. And just to really hammer home the grimdark of this whole thing, Space Marines generally prefer their initiates to be no older than 12. As it takes at least 5 years of surgical implantation, hypnotic indoctrination, and combat training to turn an ordinary human into a superhuman Astartes. The exact process of gene seed implantation would require a video in and of itself, but suffice it to say, at the completion of the ascension process, a Space Marine will stand head and shoulders taller than a baseline human and is often half again as broad, due to increased muscle mass. A Space Marine's bones are also far denser than that of a normal human skeleton, and the rib bones have fused together to form a solid bone plate. In addition to their enhanced strength and durability, Space Marines also possess superhuman senses of smell, hearing, and sight, up to and including night vision. They possess backup organs such as a secondary heart, a tertiary lung, an enhanced kidney to purge the body of poisons, and superplatelets called Lerman cells that causes blood to coagulate the instant it comes into contact with the air in order to prevent bleed out. But that's relatively standard procedure for a gene-enhanced super soldier. Space Marines also possess gene seed organs with more esoteric abilities, shall we say, such as the Becher's gland, which produces acidic poison that a Space Marine can spit at his enemies should he find himself lacking other weapons. The Sus-An membrane, which enables a Space Marine to enter suspended animation for an indefinite period of time, and the Omeophagus, which allows a Space Marine to absorb information from what they eat. For example, say a Space Marine lands on an unknown planet and consumes a small animal native to that planet. He will then know what plants that animal eats, where water might be found, and what predators are to be avoided. There are a grand total of 19 separate gene seed organs for your average Astartes, but there are only 2 that are really worth focusing on in this more general video: the progenoid glands and the black carapace. The 2 progenoid glands, one implanted in the neck and another in the chest cavity, are there to collect and store the gene seed that, by now, is filling the Space Marine's body. After 5 or 10 years, these glands can then be removed, usually upon the death of the Space Marine, and the gene seed collected inside the glands can be used to create more gene seed organs and thus more Space Marines. Given that it is strongly hinted that Space Marines are sterile and devoid of any sex drive, this is the closest to reproduction that they can get. Meanwhile, the black carapace is an added subdermal layer that enables a Space Marine to interface directly with his power armor. Now, Space Marines aren't the only beings in 40k to use powered armor. The Sisters of Battle use them, as do certain Inquisitors, and the various alien races have their own equivalents. But where the others wear their power armor like armor, a Space Marine's black carapace enables him to wear his armor like a second skin. The power armor itself, comprised of layers of ceramite, plasteel, and adamantium, because of course 40K, like all sci-fi universes, has to have its own stronger-than-steel fictional alloys, comes with a back-mounted power generator, a helmet with a full suite of comm and sensory equipment, and pseudo-muscle fiber bundles that add to the already insane strength of an Astartes. Of course, when one is talking about the iconic power armor of the Space Marine, one also has to address the Space Marine's iconic weapon, the bolt gun, or bolter. Again, this isn't a weapon unique to the Space Marines, nor the only weapon that they will use, but like power armor, the bolter is strongly associated with the Space Marines. As to what a bolter is, imagine a machine gun, only instead of bullets, it fires small rocket-propelled grenades encased inside an armor-piercing shell. The operative logic is that when the projectile is fired, it penetrates the opponent and then explodes inside, thus maximizing both external and internal damage. Considering this equipment, combined with their superhuman physiology, it's really not surprising that the Legiones Astartes were able to successfully conquer most of the Milky Way for the Emperor in less than 2 centuries. And doubtless, everything would have gone swimmingly if the Chaos Gods had not successfully corrupted 9 of the Primarchs and their respective legions and turned them against the Emperor. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, with the Emperor all but dead and entombed within the Golden Throne, the surviving loyalist Primarchs were left to pick up the pieces, and one of them, Rabute Guilliman, concluded that the heresy had been so terrible because the Legiones Astartes had concentrated too much power in the hands of a few individuals. To prevent such a thing from ever happening again, he proposed the implementation of a tactical and organizational manual called the Codex Astartes. Among other things, the Codex demanded that the remaining loyalist legions be broken down into chapters of no more than 1,000 battle brothers apiece. And while the degree of actual adherence to the Codex Astartes varies from chapter to chapter, it has remained the basis of modern Space Marine organization. In the 41st millennia, a Space Marine chapter comes in one of 2 varieties. In the first example, a Space Marine chapter occupies a planet, establishes a base of operations known as a fortress monastery, and oversees the system in which that planet resides, usually recruiting new Astartes and non-Astartes personnel, known as chapter serfs, from the local planetary population. In certain instances, a chapter master functions as a planetary governor, holding de facto power over the planet and its inhabitants. The other example is known as a fleet-based chapter, in which instance the Space Marines live entirely aboard their starships, patrolling either a sector or subsector of Imperial space, generally recruiting from whatever worlds they happen to pass by. As per the Codex Astartes, each chapter is comprised of no more than 1,000 Space Marines, not counting officers and certain specialists. The Space Marines are in turn divided into 10 companies of 100 apiece, plus their equipment and vehicles, such as Rhino armored personnel carriers, Thunderhawk gunships, attack bikes, etc. Each company is led by a captain, who is in turn supported by 10 sergeants, each in command of a squad. Companies 2 through 5 are referred to as the battle companies, as they are the ones that will be sent into the fray first whenever trouble happens. Meanwhile, companies 6 through 9 are referred to as the self-explanatory reserve companies. Both battle and reserve companies are comprised of 3 different types of Marine. Assault Marines, specializing in close combat and fast attack, Devastator Marines, specializing in long range and heavy weaponry, and the flexible jack-of-all-trades Tactical Marine, which usually comprises the majority of these companies. The 10th Company is referred to as the Scout Company, and while its officers are experienced veterans, the majority of Scout Marines are comprised of young neophytes that haven't yet completed the transition from human to Astartes. As the name implies, Scout Marines are mostly used for reconnaissance, as the primary role of the 10th Company is to give the young neophytes some form of combat experience while also maximizing their chances of actually making it to the status of full battle brother. At the opposite end is the 1st Company, the Veteran Company. These are the chapter's elite, its best and brightest, those Space Marines experienced enough or accomplished enough to be deemed worthy of training in the use of the rare and highly prized suits of Terminator armor. A Space Marine in full Terminator armor is much larger and heavier than a normal Space Marine, and what Terminator armor lacks in speed and mobility, it more than makes up for in strength and the ability to use weapons that, to a normal human, would count as field artillery and are simply too large and cumbersome for even a Space Marine in normal armor to use effectively. While we're on the subject of veterans, it is speculated, and confirmed in some sources, though denied in others, that Space Marines are biologically immortal. We'll never really know for sure because, given the violent lives they lead, Space Marines have only ever died in combat. In the rare instance that a Space Marine is too crippled to be returned to active service, but can still be saved, and especially if said Space Marine has a long and distinguished career behind him, the Space Marine's brutalized body is removed from his power armor, hooked up to a heavily armored cockpit/life support system known as a sarcophagus, yes, that is their word for it, and entombed inside a moderately sized walking tank known as a dreadnought. It is generally considered a great honor for a wounded Space Marine to become a dreadnought and fight eternally against the Emperor's enemies. Some dreadnoughts, such as Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves chapter, are old enough to have been alive during the Great Crusade. Such long-lived dreadnoughts, known as venerables, are revered for their wisdom and long experience. Such dreadnoughts are even called upon by the chapter's leadership when a difficult decision needs to be made. That said, being a crippled lump of flesh inside of an armored shell is a very uncomfortable, even painful experience. As such, most dreadnoughts are usually shut down and kept in stasis, only awakened when they need to go into battle. A chapter's command structure is relatively simple. At the top there is the chapter master, the military commander and de facto leader. Should the chapter master die in battle, this being the only real way that turnover ever occurs within a Space Marine chapter, he is succeeded by the most senior captain, usually the captain of the 1st Company. The Master of the Fleet is an office that only exists in the event that the chapter in question actually has a fleet. As the title implies, he is in command of the chapter's voidcraft, and is the resident expert on space battle. In the cases of fleet-based chapters, the office of Chapter Master and Master of the Fleet are one and the same. The Master of Sanctity, meanwhile, is in charge of the Space Marine chaplains. Chaplains are essentially warrior priests. In addition to their obvious combat roles as battle brothers, they are also entrusted with educating, read indoctrinating, neophytes into the traditions of the chapter and its particular version of the Imperial Creed, as well as providing spiritual guidance to their comrades. For the culture of a Space Marine chapter is often heavily influenced by the culture of the world or worlds that it recruits from. Chaplains are usually distinguished by their skull-faced helmets and the fact that their power armor is painted entirely black, save for one shoulder pad, which is left to retain the chapter colors and icon. Next is the Chief Apothecarian and his apothecaries, essentially Space Marine combat medics, distinguished by the fact that their armor, save for one shoulder, is painted white. Although they are trained to treat and repair the unique physiology of their fellow Space Marines, an apothecary's most important duty is the safe removal of progenoid glands from dead Space Marines. As I said earlier, progenoid glands contain gene seed, which is used in turn to make new organs to be implanted into future Space Marines. A chapter's progenoid glands are essentially its legacy and its future, and are prized beyond all other things. In fact, where most planetary governments pay taxes to the Imperium in the form of money, resources, or recruits for the armed forces, Space Marine tithes are in gene seed. The gene seed is stored in massive gene vaults within Terra, and when the stockpile has become sufficiently large, the High Lords may declare a founding of brand new Space Marine chapters using these genetic stockpiles. Next is the Master of the Forge, overall leader of the chapter's Tech Marines. Most Space Marine chapters enjoy a very close relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus, and as such, certain members of each chapter are taken to Mars and trained in the sacred arts of the machine. Tech Marines are therefore entrusted with the maintenance and repair of the chapter's vehicles, weapons, and equipment. Their armor, save for the obligatory shoulder pad, is painted a rust red in honor of this connection between the chapter and the Martian tech priests. Finally, there is the Chief Librarian, head of the chapter's Librarius, whose armor is painted blue. In spite of the Imperium's long-running prejudice against Psychers, the Adeptus Astartes are one of the few institutions that will willingly induct Psychers into their ranks. After all, a Psycher converted into a trained and disciplined Librarius can be a useful asset against the powers of chaos. But of course, being Psychers, they are still held at arm's length by most of their battle brothers. Before we wrap this video up, a brief note on the Adeptus Astartes' unique relationship with the wider Imperium. Although counted an official Adeptus and therefore part of the Imperial government, most Space Marine chapters prefer to work independently. Their oaths of loyalty are to the God Emperor himself, and they have little patience for the scheming and manipulations of the High Lords of Terra. That's not to say that they operate above the law like the Inquisition does. The best way to sum this up is that the Space Marines do agree that humanity must be defended, but they also have their own ideas as to how humanity may best be defended, and they will generally go along with that rather than obey any official mandate. While there are several Space Marine chapters that work closely with the Inquisition, some even going so far as being full chamber militants like the Death Watch or the Grey Knights, a Space Marine is perhaps the only human in the galaxy that can actually get away with telling an Inquisitor exactly what he can do with his rosette and his unlimited authority, which naturally annoys the Inquisition to no end. To the average citizen of the Imperium, the Space Marine is a figure of legend, regarded with awe, admiration, and fear. They are referred to by such grandiose nicknames as the Emperor's Avenging Angels or the Angels of Death, to name a few. And given their superhuman abilities, it's not that hard to see why. It's ironic, but also somehow fitting, that in this grim, dark universe where there is only war, humanity's greatest defenders are themselves the least human of them all. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.